All right, we'll get started here. Appreciate everybody's time this morning. I know we had a failed start the last time around, but I'm glad we got everybody together this morning. We're very excited to be working with Brody. I got to know them a few years ago, and I've held them in pretty high regard ever since. So this is a pleasure for us. It's we're happy to be associated with Brody. There's also some names that I recognize on the call, which is always really nice. So I appreciate everybody joining, appreciate the time. We're relatively, we'll go through the technology in the company, but this is our first year on the market, commercially available. So still pretty new. We feel very confident in the experiences that we've had so far, and certainly we'll talk about some use cases and some examples. But as we go through these slides, please feel free to come off mute, ask questions. If you're more comfortable putting questions in the chat, feel free to do that. But generally, my goal today is just share a little bit about us, what we're trying to do, what we have built, typical projects that we have seen, typical sort of applications that we have seen, and then as thoughts come into your minds that we have not touched on, please ask us. It's very likely we haven't had it's very likely that we haven't had to answer some questions. So we're very excited about learning and uncovering some new thoughts with you today. So we're PingCx. That's the name of our product. We affectionately call ourselves PingCx. Our company name is Ping Building Systems Inc. We have been around now, like I said, for about a year. What we plan to be is a platform that helps folks like yourselves, control contractors, really automate and speed up the delivery of project work for building automation work on the projects that you do. So we aim to be a platform that automates typical startup routines that your technicians might do out in the field, simple point-to-points, and then let's call it a full service approach to truly automating the commissioning process for just about any BACnet building automation system. Now, I say BACnet that is a bit of a catch-all. We certainly support legacy protocols, especially if they come through the JACE. But if you're in a situation where you've got some, let's call it legacy systems, a variety of different systems, please bring that to our attention. I'm sure we can figure out a way to work with that. We have not yet come across a building we haven't been able to integrate into. But just for the purposes of being a little safe, we just sort of pre-qualify and say full commissioning of any BACnet building automation system. As we go through the demo, as Jimmy walks you through the platform and what we have built and how we've built, hopefully it becomes very clear to everybody that the folks that built the tool are also controls contractors. I mean, this was built by people that do your work every day. And so this isn't, software people trying to shoehorn a solution into the controls industry. The guys who built it were looking to solve their own pain. Once they built it, we have now had the opportunity to take this commercially. So this was built back in 2021. Controls contractor called Brandon Controls out of Long Island, New York. The tool was built in-house. Today, we are in about 25 million square feet, primarily in the Northeast, a little bit of work out in California, in a continuous commissioning fashion, in an ongoing commissioning fashion. We call it lifecycle commissioning. And in those 25 million square feet, there's about 170,000 points that we are actively, recommissioning over time. Over our, let's call it the last few years of the product being used, we have actively tested about, let's call it 500,000 different BACnet points across a variety of different building types and hardware manufacturers. Our entire team is, with the exception of myself, I'm in New Jersey, and our team member Harris Darbasevich, who leads sales for us. He's in Utica, New York. I'm in New Jersey. The remainder of our entire team is in Long Island, including our developers. So just about all of our work is done here in the US. We're able to support all of our clients pretty much during your business hours. So good news here is we're trying to build a culture that's very responsive to that of the contractors that we serve. Generally, again, when we're thinking about how do we fit in or how do we augment the work that you're doing, if I were to just recap these sort of three big problems or three phases that we apply to. So the problems that we solve today, these are not going to be, this is not new news to anybody on the call. This is not going to be surprising to everybody. We all know that if we had more people on a project, we could probably do more work. We likely do less work because we'd rather do it well than take on more than we can handle and then deliver less than a result that we're less than proud of. So generally, labor is the most painful part of us delivering work out in the field. It's the most expensive part. And you couple that with arguably a very let's call it the commissioning process, which is full of friction between us, our commissioning provider that's on the project, where the last one's on. They have very strict requirements. That paired with a very tight labor force out in the field is just a recipe for a lot of pain for us as contractors out in the field. So putting tools in your hands that helps alleviate this process was the primary mission. And then I'm sure everybody on the call is just as excited at the prospect of growing your business, growing your service base, and using tools, automated technologies, to not only improve the quality of service that you provide to your owner during the service contract phase, but if there are additional opportunities for you to include new scope in your service contract, is that valuable to your owner? And so that's sort of this last piece here, is creating opportunities for enhanced services that you can then resell to your service contract customers. Typically, I used the phrase earlier, lifecycle commissioning. That's truly how we are approaching this problem, is from the initial deployment, first set of controllers go online, start doing some simple point-to-points, all the way through, let's call it a retrofit scenario where we want to just get a baseline understanding of what controllers are on a project, how they're functioning, how many points are on override, before we really touch a system in a retrofit application, or before, I don't think we would ever get a chance to do this in a pre-bid scenario, but before we, really start to take apart a system to understand what's working and what's not. This tool is very useful there. And then, of course, performing ongoing commissioning on your client sites. So generally, just a high-level recap of where we think we're most useful. We'll talk a lot more about this, these next two slides, when Jimmy is providing the demo, but generally, a very clean integration to the BMSs that that we've worked with so far. We sit, Jimmy will talk about where on the network or where in the network architecture we sit, but we are sitting as a user on that building automation network. And so we're not really reliant on trend data or naming conventions or anything along those lines that might limit your ability to use this on your project work. There's a very clean integration. Of course, cybersecurity is topic number one today across the board, across the industry. And so today we're very lucky that we do support a variety of different ways to connect to a site remotely. Of course, there is a cloud component to our solution, which is very important. But to satisfy the needs of your local client, of the IT department, there's a variety of different applications there. We are hosted on Microsoft Azure, and so there is just most IT departments understand the robustness of the cloud that we're using. So generally, there's a high degree of confidence in our ability to keep that site secure. The other benefit is the tool is highly scalable. So you can have a scenario where you can have several technicians on one project doing different parts of the scope. They're all within the tool. They're all working within the same, quote unquote, database, doing testing across, multiple phases of a project through different technicians. And the other sort of model also applies, where you can have one technician that's using this tool across, several different projects that might be ongoing at any given time. So we have not yet found an upper limit to how many simultaneous users and tests and things that we haven't yet broken it. So I welcome anybody who'd like to challenge that and try to break the tool. But so far, we're very proud of how scalable we have been. We'll go through tests and how to write tests and what that whole workspace looks like. Good news here is that not only are there easy selection wizards, there's just a vast library of pre-written tests. So learning the tool and deploying it within your project should be a pretty minor lift. We've really tried to make it as easy to use and easy to deploy as possible. And then last, very important, especially in the commissioning process, is reporting. So the ability to customize the output, or why use this tool, because of the reporting or the capability to uncover information, the ability to customize your reporting is pretty strong within the tool. We'll go into this in a lot more detail, but generally, working with the database from that building automation hardware manufacturer, whether it's a BOG file, from a JSON or an aspect file, doesn't really matter. Importing the data, setting up the project, importing the database, figuring out the connectivity, selecting your tests, and then running your tests is a pretty straightforward process. So, Jimmy, if you want to bring up the tool, and while Jimmy's doing that, I'll just pause and ask any questions from anybody that's on the call. Give me some reaction. Okay. Jimmy, if you're ready, go ahead.
Sure thing. So right now I'm logged into PingCx. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the application, give you a sense of how easy it is to navigate and use the application and kind of leverage for your organization. PingCx, is a multi-tenant application. Basically, the data for all the customers are, isolated, secure in the cloud using Microsoft Azure technology. The layout is like most typical portals. We have a navigation menu on the left-hand side, main screen on the right. In terms of the what we call the entities, we have first is the clients, right, which represents your customers, right, the people that you're servicing. Underneath that, we have the sites, which represents the specific job locations for each one of those clients. Projects obviously represents projects, whatever the scope of work is, whether it's a new construction, retro commissioning, continuous commissioning, etc. And lastly, what we have is strategies, right, which represents a collection of these feature files and test scenarios that you ultimately run against your BMS system. On the client screen, we have some basic information related to the client and some statistics here that kind of show a roll-up of all the test runs that were completed for all the sites underneath that client. If I drill into one of the sites here, you'll see a similar screen. The exception that these statistics now are kind of a roll-up of all of the projects, for that given site. On the site level is where you define the interface. Right? The interface essentially acts as the communication layer between PingCx and the BMS backend system. We support, various platform and devices, whether it's an Aspect, JACE, web, or even standard backnet routers. You essentially, specify the IP address and port that you use to communicate. We also have the ability to take screenshots of the BMS system. So here's where you would specify the credentials and the connection URL. On the BACnet tab, there's some settings here that you can kind of tune, but based on timing delays and setting the priority slots or your change priorities. And then lastly, we have the mapping file. Mapping file, whether you're uploading the map config from an aspect system or the bog file from a JSON, we essentially take those database files and we parse them and we generate what we call this device point mapping file. All right, so this file here is basically just a parsed out listing of all the devices and points from the system, pulling out the important information, like the IP address and port, the MSTP network address, the controller address, instance ID, and ultimately the network property for each one of the points that we'll be interacting with. We also pull out things like the units and enumerations so that when you're writing these test cases, you can leverage that information so that makes it a lot more readable. Okay, so let me go back out. On the site level is also kind of where you specify the agent. The agent is ultimately, the engine that runs these test scenarios against the BMS system. So we support, various models. The first being kind of the cloud model, right, where the agent is in the cloud. There's no local install. In that case, obviously, your BMS system would need to be accessible, through the internet, whether it's through some kind of VPN, etc. The second model is kind of what we call the on-prem or local agent. The agent is installed on a workstation or an appliance that's on the BMS network, right? In that case, obviously has access to BMS network as well as access to the internet, right? So basically what that does is that the agent goes out, reaches up to the PingCx portal, is able to kind of download, the artifacts and test files. The engine will then run the tests connecting to the BMS system. Once all the tests are complete, it packages up all of the test data and pushes it back out to the cloud. The third model is kind of what we call the disconnected mode, where we recognize, not all BMS systems have access to the internet. So in that case, the agent would reside on like a technician's laptop, right? When a technician has internet access, they're in the office, they're at home, or they're have a hotspot, they can go into PingCx, schedule a job, have the agent download all the artifacts, and kind of sit there and wait until they kind of disconnect, and then they go on site and they plug into the BMS network. Once connected to the BMS network, the job will resume, run the tests. After the tests are completed, it'll kind of package everything up back onto that agent's laptop or the technician's laptop. And then once they're kind of connected back to the internet, everything will get kind of automatically pushed back up to the cloud. So they'll be, available through the portal, etc. Okay, so I'm going to drill into the projects and ultimately the strategies here. So on the strategy screen, you'll essentially see kind of a historical listing of all the test runs that were completed for that particular site/project. But obviously, before you can schedule a job, you need to create, what we call these feature files. As I mentioned before, the feature file is kind of a collection of these test scenarios that get run against the BMS system. So typically, there's a feature file for each type of unit. So in this particular example, we have one defined for the AC unit, one for the main plant, and some for the VEV boxes. Excuse me. Once those feature files are created or uploaded, you can use the schedule here to run to schedule a job. On the schedule screen, you have the ability to kind of select which feature files that you want to be included in this particular run, as well as the tag filters that you want to be included. Typically, the tag filters are tagged per test scenario. So early on in kind of the testing and commissioning process, you may only want to be running the kind of point-to-point checks, right? Where the test scenarios here are just kind of doing the point-to-point checks, making sure that the the sensors are reading properly. And then later move on to more functional tests where, those test scenarios are now, opening dampers, enabling fans, checking, confirmation, end switches, etc. And then lastly, moving on to, the more, sequencer related test cases where those test scenarios are going out and actually testing, the sequence slash strategies that are programmed on the controller. In addition to being able to select the tag filters, you also have the ability here to kind of select which units you want to be included. So again, early on, you may only have a few, VAV boxes or units that are online. You can schedule a job with just those VAVs, and then as more and more are brought online, you can now run those tests, the same tests, against, just the new boxes that are brought online, or you can kind of rerun it across, all available VAVs once they're brought online. In terms of the scheduling, you can schedule a job kind of to run immediately, or you can kind of schedule a job to run, after hours, or at a later date. And this is also kind of where you select, which agent you want those tests to run on. Okay. So once the job is scheduled, you'll see a new entry in this grid here, and it'll kind of show you as it's running, kind of an update of the test runs, etc. In this particular example, this was a point-to-point check. It had, a total of 18 tests, 17 succeeded, and 1 failed. Right down here kind of shows you which feature files were selected and which tag filters were selected for that particular run. So let's take a look at the report that generated. Okay, so if I drill in here, again, this is the dry cooler feature file, right, with the point-to-point scenario checks. So on the left-hand side here are the steps that are written for each test scenario. In this particular case, it was a point-to-point check, right? So the steps are, given no preconditions, then the room auxiliary zone temperature should be between 40 degrees and 95 degrees. So what happens is that when PingCx gets this test scenario, it goes out and it reads the point from the controller, right? So in this case, it's getting a value of 64.92 for the zone temperature, and then it's checking that it's within the range of 40 degrees and 95 degrees. In this case, these are just kind of arbitrary values just to kind of indicate that, we're getting a proper sensor reading for the zone temperature. So in comparison, excuse me, if we take a look at one of these test cases that failed, you'll see that here, a similar test scenario, point-to-point check, but in this case, it's looking at the supply water temperature, checking that it's between 40 degrees and 95 degrees. And in the trace, you'll see here, when it goes out and tries to read that temperature, it's getting a value of -1,000. Right, obviously, that's not within the range of 40 and 95, and thus that test case fails. So one of the other reports that we generate is kind of more of a punch list style report. So in this case here, it's the same feature file. You see the same scenario, and certainly you have the ability to kind of filter inside Excel to look at only your failed scenarios. So in this case, obviously, it's a very simple example of just the one dry cooler plant with the 1 failure. But you can imagine if this test was scheduled for hundreds of VAV boxes, hundreds of units, with dozens of failures. Right now, you have essentially, a punch list where a technician kind of use that to start the investigation, right? Instead of manually connecting to each one of those VAV boxes and manually checking each one of those sensors, you can have PingCx kind of do the heavy lifting, right, and save that time of someone manually doing these checks. And now you can kind of work off that punch list and start looking at just the the issues and errors that were reported from after the test. Okay, so I'm going to close this one, and let's take a look at the next report here. So in this particular instance, it's kind of labeled as a full run. You'll see here, multiple feature files that were selected, as well as the tag filters, and in addition of doing screenshots are enabled. So let's take a look at the detail report. All right, so let's take a look at the example for the dry cooler feature file and the first scenario, which was kind of labeled as a functional scenario for the dry cooler fan 1 control. So again, on the left-hand side, here are the steps. So given that the dry cooler system is enabled, when I override the fan 1 command to be enabled, and I wait up to 60 seconds, then the expectation is that fan 1 confirmation should equal on. So you see that on the right-hand side here, in the trace, PingCx is going out, reading that system enable point. It's currently in an enabled state, so it's saying that it's enabled. Next, it does, essentially an override, a backnet override on fan1 command. So it's currently in a disabled state. It's doing a backnet override to enable, waiting up to 60 seconds, and then the expectation is that fan confirmation should equal on. So you'll see that PingCx goes out, reads that confirmation, it's getting a value of on, checking against the value on, and say it passed. On the right-hand side here, you'll see that we are able to take a screenshot. So as mentioned before, during these tests, we have the ability to go out and take screen captures of the graphics from the BMS system. Right, many times, when we're working with commissioning agents, as we're running these tests, they always like, oh, let's take a screenshot of it, right? To one, kind of gives you kind of a visual confirmation of the points that you're dealing with are also mapped correctly to the graphics. So in this case, we're overriding fan1 command to be enabled and checking the fan1 confirmation, right? And it also kind of provides, additional points that are related to that unit, so that this way, they have those values at that point in time, and there's no need to kind of sit there as they kind of copy the values and fill out their testing forms, while you're going through this step. So it provides that, documentation as part of this process. So to continue on with this test scenario, so we enable the fan, check confirmation, and then in this test, we're kind of doing the reverse, right? So here, we're overriding the fan1 command to be disabled, waiting up to 60 seconds, and then the expectation is that we would lose confirmation, right? So again, on the trace, you'll see that, the fan is currently enabled. Now we're doing a backnet override to disable it, waiting up to 60 seconds, and then checking that confirmation. And then you'll see here, this is kind of the equivalent screenshot. So now you'll see that the fan1 command is now overridden to be disabled, and we lost confirmation as expected. Okay. And then lastly here, you'll see that, after the tests are completed, you'll see this kind of restore points and clear variables tag listed on the trace. So as PingCx is going through these test scenarios, each test step, it's keeping track of any changes that it's making, to the system, right? So whether it's a set point change or override, it's keeping track of all that, so that at the end of the scope, whether it's on a scenario level or on the feature level, it's putting things back to where it found it, right? So this way, it kind of eliminates that user error of someone keeping track of whatever set points the values were before they made the change, right? Or in the cases of when you're overriding something, being able to kind of relinquish that after you're done with the test, right? Sometimes when you're trying to run these tests manually, you're going out and you're kind of overriding 4, 5, 6, 7 units. At the end of the test, you have to kind of go back and remember to kind of relinquish those values, right? Sometimes hey, out of the 7 you missed one, now your system is no longer in an auto state. So PingCx kind of takes that out of the equation, all the user error. It's kind of tracking it automatically and kind of putting everything back to where I found it. Okay, so the next example I want to just quickly show is kind of related to VAV boxes, right? So in this case, we have VAV 1-10, and the scenario is called, check flow max, right? So the steps here are given no preconditions. When I override the 1-10 box mode to the max flow rate, wait up to 180 seconds, then the measured flow should be within 15% of the max flow set point. Comparison, if I scroll on to VAV 1-1, you'll see that it's the same test scenario, check flow max, but in this case, we're dealing with different points here, right? So for VAV 1-1, we're overriding a point called group 0 tab code to max flow rate, waiting up to 180 seconds, and then checking the primary airflow CV should be within 15% of the primary airflow effective max set point. Right, so I'm going to jump into the editor to kind of show you how we do that. As mentioned before, out of the box, we provide kind of this UI to help guide users how to create these test scenarios. So the interface essentially, has a drop down that kind of guides you on what are the available steps. So, when that's typically your actions. So whether you're kind of computing something, right, or doing a wait, you have the ability to kind of filter and select which steps that you want. Whereas the thens are your assertions, your checks, where you're checking something is equal to something, or checking something is between multiple values. You can select that step, and then the UI will essentially guide you on how to, populate the, the parameters for that. So whether you're selecting, a placeholder in the file, right, or you're selecting, a specific point, the UI kind of prompts you and kind of gives you the ability to guide you in selecting the points from the system. As mentioned earlier, we leverage those database files from each one of those front-end platforms. We parse those devices and points, and we make them, all available here through the UI. So we recognize that, with anything new, there's always a little bit of a learning curve, right? So that's why kind of the UI kind of guides you, helps makes it very simple for users to build these test scenarios, right? But we also offer kind of just a standard text editor, right? Where, over time, once you kind of get familiar with the syntax of the DSL, we find out a lot of times it's much simpler for someone to kind of type it out, or, you can kind of make quick edits or kind of copy and paste scenarios, and it's much quicker than kind of using the UI. But any changes that you make, on the text editor or the UI will kind of, bi-directional, so that it kind of updates as you move along. So going back to that VAV example, we're looking at this check flow max test scenario. So you'll see here, when you write these tests, you're kind of writing it generically, right? And the concept is, once you've written one of these test scenarios, you leverage it over and over for multiple type of VAVs, or from project to project. So in this test scenario, the steps, given no preconditions, when I override the box override mode to max flow rate, wait up to 180 seconds, then the VAV measured flow should be within 15% of the max flow set point. We go to the data file. Here is kind of where you map those placeholders, which are listed here on top, to the actual, units and points from your system. So we see here for VAV 1-1, the box override mode point was labeled as group 0 tab code, right? And the measured flow was labeled as, primary airflow CV. Whereas VAV 1-10, it's called box mode and measured flow, right? So it doesn't matter, what type of controls that you're using or manufacturer, or you have kind of a mixture of VAV boxes, controllers, whether you're dealing with, like a retro commissioning, retro sites where you have some legacy controllers versus new controllers, it doesn't really matter. Once you kind of have that test scenario written, you're simply just kind of doing the mapping between the placeholder and, in that particular unit, or, and the points that are associated with that unit. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to, other thing I want to show is related to the scenario workspace. Right, as kind of mentioned, out of the box, with PingCx, we provide, a library, of these test scenarios that you can kind of use for your projects, right? These system library is available to all of our PingCx customers, right? Where these are the test scenarios that we provide, and then we kind of add to as we build out the system with with new examples. But the customer library here is specific to each customer, right? So the concept is you can certainly take any of the templates from the system library, import into your customer library, and kind of use it as is. Or if you find one doesn't exactly meet the sequence that that you have for a particular project. You can kind of take it, modify it, etc., and add it to your customer library. Once you kind of have your customer library kind of filled out, populated, now all of your technicians can kind of leverage those same test scenarios so that you're never writing anything from scratch, right? And this way, there's also kind of a consistency between each technician. And from project to project, you're kind of using the same test scenarios that are kind of built towards the type of units that you're typically dealing with. So in terms of the demo, I think that kind of covers what I wanted to cover. So I guess after I'll hand it back to Saheel, and then we can have the Q&A session.
No, thanks, Jimmy. Let me pause and see any questions from anybody. Is this generally applicable to your day-to-day? I'm happy to pick on anyone. Go ahead, Ben, you're raising your hand with the question.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Good. So I just had a question about the points or the placeholder mapping. How that's in? Did you say that that placeholder mapping, is that done in the initial like system scan, or is that something that needs to be done manually? I can't remember how you said that was performed.
In regards to the placeholders, so essentially there's kind of two ways. I mean, certainly you can create the placeholders here, as part of the data file. Anything that you get, let's say add one here. When you define that placeholder, it will kind of be made available in the UI, right? So
I see what you're saying.
Right. So now you can kind of select it as that, or you can actually add it here, right? Right. As you're building these test scenarios, you can you can create the placeholders, which ultimately will show up in the data file, and you just have to kind of map, the placeholder with the actual point name.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, since you asked the question, if you don't mind, I'll just pick on you a little bit. If you wouldn't mind, just a reaction from what you have seen so far. Is this applicable in your day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I do every day. So I write test scripts, and I'm trying to build my own library. But if if I have a tool like this, it seems like it'd be a lot easier to store those libraries and apply or adjust them, create new ones, apply them to, and adjust them as needed. So yeah, this is on point.
Right. And the idea behind kind of the syntax or the DSL is that it's basically the same steps that one would kind of do manually, right, when they're commissioning a system, taking a sequence, right, kind of converting it to these steps, that kind of you would normally do manually, but PingCx is kind of taking that legwork and kind of doing it, for you, and kind of consistent, from each box to, next.
That makes sense. So essentially, you still have to write or compile your test, but then I guess I think you're saying the agent is the actual user that's configured within Niagara or whatever platform, and then that agent is what is actually going through and following the test script that you write.
That's correct. It's running the test script. It's going out to each one of those boxes, reading each one of those points, or writing to those points, and kind of doing all the steps kind of in an automated fashion.
Very good. Very good.
Feel free to answer this, Ben, or if anybody else on the call wants to answer. But from what you have seen so far, is connectivity to the BMS a concern, or performing this testing on a BMS system, is that feasible from what you have all seen so far?
That was a question I had, because I know that for our organization, we use Tosibox or Tosibox keys. Is that something that this platform is set up to interact with or through?
Yeah, so as long as the agent, excuse me, can get to the BMS network as well as to the internet, then that's all that's kind of really required from kind of a high level perspective.
Okay.
Generally, an area that many have concerns with initially is just figuring out that connectivity piece. What's the best way to provide access to the BMS in a secure way so that this tool can do what it needs to do, deliver, then take that data and that result back up, generate whatever reporting, and then, distribute that to the various stakeholders. We have fortunately been able to satisfy some pretty picky IT departments for existing buildings, whether it's a retrofit or an expansion. Generally, when either the BMS server is a virtual machine on a corporate network somewhere, or we need to rely on some corporate connectivity, we have been able to satisfy some pretty stringent requirements, both from a technical perspective and from an insurance perspective. So if that's a concern, I'd love to answer questions now and of course offline. Any reaction in terms of where this would be most applicable? Is consent, any strong feelings one way or the other for people on the call? Is this more applicable from your perspective in a construction setting or in a service setting? Any strong feelings on that topic? Marshall, if you don't mind, maybe I'll pick on you. What are your thoughts? What have you seen from what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think it looks very useful. Reminds me of some older technology, kind of simplified. One question that just when I'm processing here, for those that are not using Aspect any longer, or possibly even Niagara, what is your agent look like for on-premise? And I'm assuming it's pushing outbound. If the agent's on site, is that a Windows agent that you would just install on a Windows machine?
Yeah, that's correct. It's go ahead, Jimmy. Why don't you answer?
No. Yeah, that's correct. It's typically Windows machine. I think we do support Linux for those out there as well.
But the utility itself is actually, one of it's a Microsoft Dev tool agent. So it's not, again, from an IT department perspective, it's not an executable that some third-party firm has developed. It has the appropriate, development cycles from Microsoft.
Yeah, and I think that's something we'll probably dig in later. I have to research that a little bit with Dan Boyer on maybe some of our applications, because they would be most likely non-JACE, non-Aspect type systems where our potential to use it would be.
Yeah, we've fortunately seen examples. So, this is our first full year out on the market commercially, as you've gathered. Just given the roots of how this tool was built, yes, a lot of ABB Aspect expertise and a very neat integration with Niagara. But over this past year, we have come across Metasys and FX databases, which we've been able to integrate pretty natively. Recently, we've done some Schneider integrations that we've been able to do very natively. And so I would say that as you're thinking about how this might apply to your day-to-day, for non-JCI, non-Aspect, non-Tridium front end, I would appreciate people bringing those to our attention so that we can learn from those databases. Our team has been really strong with our ability to tweak our parser engine to be able to ingest, databases and make sense of that information. So we've had strong results with those with those manufacturers that we've seen so far, but certainly would like to do more.
So I saw in the original screen there when you were picking what kind of database to import, you also had a option for just a backnet router. There would be no
That's
database
correct.
per se there to import. What does that look like?
Right. So in that case, I mean, really, so really what needs to be kind of provided as the source in that case would just kind of be this device point mapping, right? I mean, PingCx takes those, platform databases and we kind of, parse the data devices and points into the file. But if you're just using kind of a standard, backnet router, obviously there is no database per se. So ultimately, you just kind of need to provide a points list, right? Whether you're kind of exporting this from, from another system, or you just have a capture file, or just a standard definition of the points, then that's all that really that's needed to kind of feed the system. But if you have obviously a bog file, map config, it makes it easier because you presumably you've already kind of defined all those points in those systems that we're kind of able to leverage that information and use that.
As this tool is sort of percolating, and as folks on the call have questions, please don't hesitate to. We're of course happy to answer any questions, but my request would be if we could just route them through your appropriate Brody representative, and whether it's just a simple question or if you'd like to dive in a little deeper and peek under the hood a little more. Feel free to make that request. We're very happy to accommodate. Brian, I'll leave to you. Any final thoughts here?
No, I think it went well. Appreciate it.
No, it's our pleasure. We're of course very excited to try this out in a variety of situations. I'll just quickly share in terms of where this has seen the most, or where we have seen the most success with this. We've seen a few clients use this tool to do commissioning on projects that they were about to turn over. One statistic that comes to mind from somebody who was piloting this tool earlier in the year, they did 80 VAV boxes in about 6 minutes in a hospital setting. We did a full recommissioning of a building automation system in a hospital out in California. Let's say, about 2.5 months of manual labor condensed down into about 2 weeks worth of time, right? That's setting up the tool, running the tests, and compiling the reporting. So that was a, very nice win there. We've of course done, dozens of K through 12 so far, lots of commercial office buildings. I'll say that, that primarily that's where we have seen the most success so far. Of course, this would be applicable anywhere our BMS is being used. But if there are particularly sensitive or complex environments that you'd like to apply this on, we're really happy to support in whatever capacity you might need. But appreciate everybody's time and attention this morning. Feel free to reach out, and we're very happy to help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.